The war America won by accident and totally screwed up. The Spanish-American War may have lasted only 4 months, but it produced enough incompetence to fill a decade. From a newspaper baron who literally printed his way into a war, to military leaders who sent troops to fight tropical diseases with winter wool uniforms. Welcome back to Varied History. Let's take a deep dive. Here are some of the biggest blunderers of the Spanish-American War. William Randolph Hearst, the media mogul who made war. For our first master of mayhem, let's talk about William Randolph Hearst. In 1898, this newspaper tycoon controlled a media empire that reached millions of Americans daily. The son of a California mining millionaire, Hearst had turned his father's money into something far more powerful: the ability to shape public opinion on a massive scale. Armed with sensational headlines and a complete disregard for the facts, Hearst didn't just report the news, he manufactured it. His New York Journal battled Joseph Pulitzer's New York World in a circulation war that would make modern clickbait look subtle by comparison. The stakes were simple. Whoever sold more papers won, and nothing sold papers like a good war. His big idea that war sells papers better than peace ever could. Stories of Spanish atrocities, Cuban suffering, and American honor under attack filled his front pages daily. The New York Journal became a propaganda machine, turning out lurid illustrations of Spanish soldiers strip-searching American women, tales of concentration camps that would make your blood boil, and maps showing Spanish threats to American shipping. Hearst's staff didn't just write stories, they invented them. When illustrator Frederick Remington cabled from Cuba saying there was no war to draw, Hearst allegedly replied, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Whether he actually said those exact words is debatable, but the sentiment was crystal clear in every edition. There was just one problem. Most of it was either wildly exaggerated or completely made up. Hearst pushed hard for military intervention, convincing politicians and the public that America's destiny lay in liberating Cuba. His newspapers portrayed Spain as a dying medieval empire, brutalizing innocent Cubans just 90 miles from Florida. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 sailors, Hearst immediately blamed Spanish sabotage. "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became his war cry, plastered across newspaper stands from coast to coast. Never mind that no evidence pointed to Spanish involvement. Evidence was for boring newspapers that didn't sell copies. General Nelson Miles, the glory hunter, in charge. We've all seen them, aging generals fighting yesterday's wars with yesterday's tactics. Which brings us to General Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the U.S. Army in 1898. A Civil War veteran with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive ego, Miles saw the Spanish-American War as his chance for one final moment of glory before retirement. Miles had spent decades fighting Native Americans on the frontier, where modern warfare meant cavalry charges across open plains and supply lines that stretched across empty prairies. His greatest victories came against Geronimo and Chief Joseph. Brilliant tacticians, but hardly representative of what the U.S. Army would face against a European colonial power. When tasked with fighting Spain, a nation with modern Mauser rifles, artillery, and defensive fortifications, Miles applied the same frontier mindset to a completely different kind of war. His military philosophy was simple. Overwhelming force applied quickly would crush enemy resistance. It had worked against tribes with limited ammunition and no industrial base, so surely it would work against Spain. His master plan for invading Cuba involved landing 70,000 troops during the height of tropical disease season, July and August. Some historians claim they were equipped with heavy wool uniforms designed for winter campaigns in Montana, when subordinates suggested lighter clothing might be more appropriate for Caribbean warfare. Miles allegedly dismissed their concerns. American soldiers were tough, he argued, and proper uniforms maintained discipline. While Spanish forces prepared defensive positions around key ports and cities, Miles was obsessing over parade formations, ceremonial protocols, and wondering why his soldiers kept collapsing from heat stroke during training exercises in Florida. His staff meetings focused more on logistics for victory parades than on tropical medicine or guerrilla warfare tactics. The results were predictable and catastrophic. American forces suffered more casualties from typhoid, yellow fever, dysentery, and malaria than from Spanish bullets. Miles' army became a medical disaster zone, with field hospitals overwhelmed by troops who couldn't even make it to the battlefield. His tropical warfare strategy killed more Americans than the entire Spanish military managed to do. By the war's end, Miles was privately blaming everyone except himself: incompetent subordinates, corrupt contractors, inadequate supplies, and soldiers who lacked proper frontier toughness. The fact that his strategic planning had ignored every lesson of tropical warfare was, in his mind, irrelevant to the outcome. William McKinley, the reluctant warrior who built an empire. What do you think when you hear the name William McKinley? If you imagine a hesitant politician stumbling into an empire, you're pretty close to the truth. McKinley inherited the presidency in 1897 with no intention of starting a war, but he ended up launching America's first overseas imperial adventure anyway. McKinley wasn't a warmonger. He was actually the opposite. This Ohio businessman turned president believed in protective tariffs, gold standards, and keeping America focused on domestic prosperity. His political hero was Abraham Lincoln, and his foreign policy could be summed up in 2 words: avoid trouble. But McKinley was also a political weather vane who couldn't resist public pressure when it came from every direction. He'd spent his entire career reading polls, counting votes, and giving people what they wanted. The problem was that in 1898, what people wanted was war. After the Maine explosion, McKinley faced a perfect storm. Hearst newspapers screaming for war, congressional Republicans demanding military action, and public opinion polls showing overwhelming support for intervention. Democratic opponents accused him of cowardice, while his own party threatened to abandon him if he didn't act decisively. Terrified of appearing weak or losing Republican control of Congress in the midterm elections, McKinley did what politicians do. He gave the people what they thought they wanted. On April 11, 1898, he asked Congress for authority to use military force in Cuba, knowing full well that such authority meant war. But McKinley had no plan for what came after victory. His strategic thinking stopped at defeat Spain and liberate Cuba. When Admiral Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1st, suddenly America owned the Philippines, a collection of 7,000 islands populated by millions of people who had been fighting for independence long before American ships appeared on the horizon. McKinley later admitted he couldn't even find the Philippines on a map when the war started. He spent sleepless nights pacing the White House, praying for divine guidance on what to do with his accidental empire. His solution was to ask God, who apparently told him to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, most of whom had been Catholic for 3 centuries. What followed was 3 years of brutal counterinsurgency warfare that made the Spanish-American War look like a picnic. Filipino revolutionaries led by Emilio Aguinaldo turned against their supposed American liberators, and McKinley found himself fighting the exact kind of colonial war he'd never wanted to start. The irony was crushing. McKinley had reluctantly gone to war to liberate people from Spanish colonialism, only to become a colonial power himself. By the time an assassin's bullet ended his presidency in 1901, America controlled more foreign territory than it had gained in the previous 50 years combined. The embalmed beef scandal, when the army poisoned itself. There are a lot of ways to lose a war, but few armies manage to poison themselves with their own food supply. The commissary disaster of 1898 became known as the embalmed beef scandal, and it nearly killed more American soldiers than Spanish bullets ever did. When the War Department mobilized for Cuba, they faced a logistical nightmare: how to feed 270,000 troops in tropical conditions with 1890's food preservation technology. The Army had never supplied forces of this size for overseas deployment, and their existing supply system was designed for small frontier garrisons, not massive expeditionary forces. Their solution was to contract with major meatpacking companies, primarily Armour and Swift, to supply canned beef that could survive Caribbean heat and humidity. The contracts were worth millions of dollars and were negotiated with the kind of speed that should have raised red flags. But this was wartime, and speed mattered more than scrutiny. The theory was sound, but the execution was catastrophic. Contractors eager to maximize profits on cost-plus government contracts shipped meat that was either spoiled before it left the factory or chemically treated with preservatives that hadn't been tested for human consumption. Some of it had been rejected by European buyers and redirected to American troops. Soldiers opened cans to find meat that looked, smelled, and tasted like it had been soaking in formaldehyde, because it actually had been. The chemical preservation process used by contractors turned beef into something that could survive tropical heat but couldn't be safely consumed by human beings. The nickname embalmed beef wasn't just soldier humor. It was an accurate description. Troops who ate the rations suffered from food poisoning, stomach cramps, and digestive diseases that left entire regiments combat ineffective. Some units refused to eat the supplied meat entirely, preferring to forage for fruit, hunt local animals, or go hungry rather than risk the consequences. General Miles himself became violently ill after sampling the rations, and his aide-de-camp spent 3 days vomiting after eating what was supposed to be a routine meal. When field commanders reported that their men were more afraid of the food than of Spanish bullets, War Department officials initially dismissed the complaints as typical soldier griping. When investigators finally examined the scandal after the war, they found corruption at every level. Contractors had knowingly shipped contaminated products. Military inspectors had been bribed to approve spoiled meat, and the War Department officials had ignored repeated warnings from field commanders. The whole system was rotten from top to bottom, literally. The scandal eventually led to congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act. But for the soldiers who survived on hardtack and tropical fruit rather than risk the embalmed beef, the reforms came too late to matter. The Rough Riders Amateur Hour at San Juan Hill. The 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders, became the most famous unit of the Spanish-American War, led by Theodore Roosevelt, a politician with no military experience but unlimited enthusiasm. This collection of cowboys, college athletes, and society adventurers embodied everything both inspiring and ridiculous about American war-making in 1898. Roosevelt recruited his regiment like he was organizing a safari expedition. He wanted men who could ride hard and shoot straight, so he gathered ranchers from the Dakotas, polo players from Harvard, former lawmen from Arizona, and anyone else who looked good on horseback and had romantic ideas about warfare. His recruitment standards were uniquely American. Harvard graduates served alongside Nevada cowboys, New York policemen bunked with Texas Rangers, and millionaire sportsmen shared tents with professional hunters. It was democracy in action, if democracy meant letting rich guys play soldier while actual professionals did the real work. The problem was they shipped to Cuba without their horses, turning the Rough Riders into the Rough Walkers. The Army's transportation system couldn't handle the logistics of moving horses to Cuba. So Roosevelt's elite cavalry regiment became elite infantry, whether they liked it or not. Their famous charge up San Juan Hill wasn't actually up San Juan Hill. It was up nearby Kettle Hill, and the confusion persists in history books to this day. And it wasn't really a charge. It was more of an uphill scramble through barbed wire while wearing those same heavy wool uniforms that were slowly cooking everyone inside. The Spanish forces defending the hill were outnumbered roughly 10-1 and had been under artillery bombardment for hours. Most of them had already begun retreating when Roosevelt's men reached the top, making the heroic assault more of a cleanup operation than a decisive battle. But Roosevelt understood something his fellow officers didn't. Wars are won by bullets, but legends are made by stories. He immediately began writing letters to newspapers describing the splendid little charge and his men's heroic behavior under fire. He gave interviews, posed for photographs, and turned a minor skirmish into the defining moment of his military career. The Rough Riders suffered relatively light casualties, 16 killed and 52 wounded out of roughly 500 men engaged. But Roosevelt made sure every American newspaper knew their names and stories. And he wrote a book about the experience, giving speeches about it for years afterwards, and eventually used it to launch his political career all the way to the White House. The regiment became symbols of American heroism and democratic values, even though their most notable achievement was not dying of heat stroke, but during a brief firefight against a retreating enemy. But in a war short on genuine heroes, Roosevelt's amateur cavalry filled a necessary role in the American imagination. Admiral Pascual Cervera, the Spanish fleet that couldn't. On the Spanish side of the disaster, Admiral Pascual Cervera knew his fleet was doomed before it even left port. Cervera commanded Spain's Atlantic Squadron, 4 armored cruisers and 2 torpedo boats destroyers that represented the last remnants of a once mighty imperial navy that had ruled the world's oceans for 3 centuries. The problem was that his ships were undermanned, undersupplied, and completely outmatched by the modern American fleet waiting in Caribbean waters. Spain's naval budget had been gutted by decades of colonial wars, domestic political instability, and economic decline. Cervera's modern warships were actually 15 years old and had never received proper maintenance or upgrades. Cervera wrote letter after letter to his superiors in Madrid, explaining in painful detail why his mission was essentially suicidal. His ships needed major engine repairs, his crew needed months of additional training, and his ammunition stores were dangerously low. Some of his vessels couldn't maintain full speed, others had faulty gun turrets, and none of them carried enough coal for extended operations. But Spanish pride and political pressure demanded that the fleet sail to defend Cuba, regardless of military reality. Politicians in Madrid couldn't admit that Spain's navy was too weak to protect Spanish territory, so they ordered Cervera to steam into battle against impossible odds. When Cervera's squadron finally limped into Santiago Harbor on May 19th, it was immediately bottled up by American warships under Admiral William Sampson and Commodore Winfield Schley. The Americans had newer ships, better trained crews, superior firepower, and overwhelming numerical advantage. For 6 weeks, the Spanish fleet sat trapped while American forces prepared to capture Santiago City. Cervera knew that staying in port meant eventual capture when the city fell, but attempting to break out meant certain destruction in open battle against superior forces. Spanish colonial authorities, desperate to maintain some semblance of honor, finally ordered Cervera to make a run for it on July 3rd. The admiral knew exactly what would happen, but military discipline demanded obedience, even unto death. The result was exactly what he had predicted, a one-sided naval battle that destroyed his entire squadron in less than 4 hours. Spanish ships were systematically hunted down and either sunk or run aground on Cuban beaches. The cruiser Almirante Oquendo exploded in a fireball that killed most of her crew. The Vizcaya was pounded into scrap metal, and Cervera's flagship, Infanta Maria Teresa, was beached as a burning wreck. Cervera himself survived and was taken prisoner, spending the rest of the war in comfortable captivity, while Spanish newspapers praised his heroic sacrifice. The tragedy wasn't that Spain lost the battle, Everyone knew that was inevitable. The tragedy was that Spanish leaders sent good men to die for political appearances rather than military necessity. General Valeriano Weyler, the butcher who made war inevitable. Before the war even began, Spanish policy in Cuba was being shaped by one of the most brutal colonial administrators of the 19th century, General Valeriano Weyler, appointed Captain General of Cuba in 1896, implemented a reconcentration policy that turned the island into a network of concentration camps and gave American newspapers all the atrocity stories they needed. Weyler's strategy was simple. If Cuban revolutionaries depended on rural populations for support, he would eliminate that support by forcing everyone into fortified towns under Spanish military control. It was collective punishment on a massive scale, designed to drain the rebellion of resources and manpower. Starting in 1896, Spanish forces began herding Cuban civilians, men, women, children, elderly, into overcrowded camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Families were given hours or sometimes minutes to abandon their homes, livestock, and crops before being marched to the nearest reconcentration center. The camps were death traps. Spanish authorities made no provision for housing, sanitation, medical care, or adequate food supplies. Families who had been self-sufficient farmers found themselves packed into disease-ridden barracks, entirely dependent on corrupt Spanish officials for survival. Conservative estimates suggest that over 100,000 Cuban civilians died in Weyler's camps, roughly 10% of the island's total population. Disease, starvation, and exposure killed entire families, while Spanish guards prevented relatives from bringing food or medicine from outside. American newspapers, led by Hearst's journal, seized on the reconcentration policy as proof of Spanish barbarity. Stories of starving children, grieving mothers, and mass graves filled American front pages daily. The coverage was often sensationalized, but the underlying reality was genuinely horrific. Weyler became known as the Butcher in American press, and his policies gave legitimacy to calls for American intervention. When politicians talked about liberating Cuba from Spanish oppression, they were talking about liberating Cubans from Weyler's concentration camps. The Spanish government eventually recalled Weyler in late 1897, hoping to reduce tensions with the United States, but the damage had been done. His reconcentration policy had turned American public opinion decisively against Spain and made some form of military intervention almost inevitable. Ironically, Weyler's brutal efficiency may have prolonged the Cuban rebellion rather than crushing it. By destroying rural communities and creating massive suffering, his policies gave Cuban revolutionaries a recruiting bonanza and American interventionists a moral justification for war. The Philippine-American War, the war nobody wanted to remember. The Spanish-American War officially ended on December 10, 1898, with the Treaty of Paris. But for the people of the Philippines, the real war was just beginning. What started as liberation from Spanish rule quickly turned into a new kind of colonialism under the American flag, complete with the same brutal tactics Americans had when Spain used them. Filipino revolutionaries had been fighting Spain for independence since 1896, 2 years before. American ships arrived in Manila Bay, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, a brilliant military commander and political organizer. They had already established a functioning government and controlled most of the archipelago outside of Manila. When Admiral Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet on May 1, 1898, Filipino leaders assumed they were fighting alongside American allies for a common cause, independence from European colonial rule. Aguinaldo even issued a declaration of Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, modeled directly on the American Declaration of Independence. They were wrong. The Treaty of Paris transferred the Philippines from Spain to the United States for $20 million with no input from the Filipino people themselves. American negotiators treated the islands like a real estate transaction, ignoring the inconvenient fact that the property was already occupied by people who had their own ideas about government. When Aguinaldo and his forces realized they had simply traded one colonial master for another, they did what any self-respecting independence movement would do. They kept fighting. The Philippine-American War began on February 4, 1899, when American and Filipino forces clashed outside Manila. What followed was 3 years of guerrilla warfare that made the Spanish-American War look like a minor skirmish. American forces trained for conventional European-style battles found themselves fighting an enemy that disappeared into jungles, blended with civilian populations, and refused to play by traditional military rules. The conflict became increasingly brutal as American commanders grew frustrated with their inability to distinguish between combatants and civilians. General Jacob Smith famously ordered his troops to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness, and other commanders implemented reconcentration policies identical to those Weyler had used in Cuba. American soldiers, many of them veterans of the Indian Wars, applied frontier warfare tactics to Philippine villages. They burned crops, destroyed water supplies, tortured prisoners for information, and established dead zones where anyone found outside designated areas could be shot on sight. The war finally ended in 1902 when Aguinaldo was captured through a combination of military pressure and political negotiations. But the cost was staggering. An estimated 200,000 Filipino citizens died from warfare, disease, and famine, while American casualties totaled over 4,000 dead and 3,000 wounded. More damaging than the casualty figures was the moral cost. Americans who had gone to war to liberate people from Spanish oppression found themselves using the same oppressive tactics used against the very people they claimed to be liberating. The contradiction was so obvious that Mark Twain suggested changing the American flag to show black stripes and skull and crossbones. The Treaty of Paris, negotiating an accidental empire. The peace negotiations that ended the Spanish-American War revealed just how unprepared America was for its new role as colonial power. The American delegation, led by William Day, arrived in Paris with no clear instructions about what to do with their unexpected territorial gains. McKinley's original war aims had been simple: Cuban independence and Spanish withdrawal from the Western Hemisphere. But military success had created new possibilities and new problems. American forces occupied Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and nobody knew what to do with them. The Spanish delegation, led by Eugenio Montero Rios, was in an impossible position. Spain had lost the war decisively, but Spanish public opinion demanded that negotiators salvage whatever dignity they could from the disaster. The result was months of bitter negotiations over territories that Spain could no longer defend. Puerto Rico and Guam were transferred to American control with minimal debate. They were small, strategically located, and could be governed as traditional colonies. Cuba presented a more complex problem, since America had promised independence but worried about political stability and economic interests. The Philippines generated the most controversy. Spain demanded $100 million in compensation for improvements made during 3 centuries of colonial rule. America initially offered nothing, arguing that Spanish improvements consisted mainly of exploitation and oppression. The final compromise satisfied nobody. America paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines, effectively purchasing 7,000 islands and 7 million people. Like a real estate transaction, Spain kept a small measure of pride by receiving some financial compensation, but lost the last remnants of its American empire. Filipino representatives were excluded from the negotiations entirely, despite being the people most affected by the outcome. Their requests for observer status were denied. Their independence movement was ignored, and their fate was decided by two European powers without consultation. The treaty was signed on December 10, 1898, but ratification in the U.S. Senate was a close vote, 57 in favor, 27 opposed, just one vote more than the required two-thirds majority. Anti-imperialist senators argued that colonial rule violated American principles, while supporters claimed that strategic and economic interests demanded territorial expansion. Conclusion: the splendid little war that changed everything. Secretary of State John Hay famously called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war, and from a narrow military perspective, he was right. American forces achieved complete victory in less than 4 months, with relatively light casualties and minimal economic disruption at home. But splendid little wars have a way of creating big problems. The conflict that began as a newspaper circulation battle ended with the United States controlling an overseas empire. Stretching from the Caribbean to the Pacific, America had stumbled into the role of global power through a combination of media manipulation, political pressure, and military success disguised as a moral crusade. The war's heroes became celebrities. Its blunders were quickly forgotten, and its lessons were largely ignored. Theodore Roosevelt rode his Rough Rider fame to the presidency. William Randolph Hearst proved that media empires could shape foreign policy, and military leaders learned that tropical warfare required different strategies than frontier campaigns. But the real consequences were measured in lives and principles rather than territory and headlines. The Philippine-American War killed more people than the Spanish-American War had liberated, and American colonial policies mirrored the Spanish oppression they had supposedly ended. The Spanish-American War marked America's transformation from a continental republic to an overseas empire, from a nation that opposed colonialism to one that practiced it. The change happened so quickly that most Americans didn't realize what they had become until it was too late to change course. And that's the most important lesson of 1898. Sometimes the most dangerous victories are the ones that come too easily, and the most costly wars are the ones that nobody expects to fight. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the history of various wars.